we are very excited and very happy to welcome you, Ruth Nyambura, today from Kenya, in these weird times, which also made us all kind of more connected to our screens. It also gave us many possibilities to, to look out transnationally, how we could enrich our queer lecture series. So we would say that this is definitely a positive thing for us, which happened through the possibilities of this year. And I am happy to get the lecture series today started with Ruth Nyambura's talk, which is titled The Politics and Possibilities of Co-Creating Anti-Capitalist and Decolonial Feminist Movements for Climate Justice. Ruth Nyambura is a Kenyan feminist and organizer whose research interests are primarily on the agrarian political economy and ecology of Africa, as well as other parts of the Global South. She has previously worked as the head of advocacy for the African Biodiversity Network and has written extensively on various aspects of the current agrarian transformations in Africa, with her overall work focusing on the ideological underpinnings of the so-called New Green Revolution in Africa and its ties to philanthropic capitalist organizations such as the Gates Foundation and the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Ruth's research also analyzes the rapidly changing policy and legislative frameworks across the continent related to biosafety and trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights regime, which are not only criminalizing the rights of small holder peasant farmers to use their traditional and indigenous seeds, but are also opening up the space for foreign agribusiness companies on the continent. Nyambura is, amongst other things, founder and convener of the African Ecofeminist Collective, as well as the No Red in Africa Collective, which challenges forest-related carbon markets and documents the impacts of these schemes on local communities in Africa. She's a board member of the Climate Justice Fund and holds a degree in comparative law, economics, and finance from the University of Turin, Italy, and has been a judge on the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature. Ruth, if you are ready to get going, I would say the floor is yours. And I hope we will all enjoy your talk.
Thank you so much. And I must say that I had briefly disappeared. So I want to start I want to think of it as a conversation. So to first of all say that I really want to acknowledge, as you said, it's been a very difficult year for so many people. We've been stuck on screens in ways that we have not been stuck on screens before. I'm sure it's really shown us that this is not the healthiest way to work. I also want to acknowledge anyone who is feeling extremely tired. I want to acknowledge that it's very late. Normally this is time people spend resting or with their families. So it's such a privilege for me to speak to you at this moment. I personally have not been well for the last few months, and it's been very apparent for me in terms of the struggle to really show up in spaces when you are physically or mentally sick or just anything is happening and your emotions are down, but you still have to show up, which I think is important. But ultimately what enables us to show up most of the times is because of community, right? And that speaks to my conversation. As I said, I'm not going to call it a talk. I'm going to call it a conversation. The possibilities of transnational, feminist solidarities, anti-capitalist movements, decolonial movements for climate justice. Because in community, I believe that we resist as a collective. It's not possible for just one person to resist and we win the battle. We have to resist in community. We have to have a politics and an ethics not around hero worship, but rooted in community. And that's what I think when I the very first time I ever read or thought about what does transnational politics actually mean, right? The possibilities of rejecting colonially imposed borders for those of us, especially those of us who are from the global south, right? The possibilities of not just refusing, white-centric, Eurocentric, patriarchal ideas that, our lives are just for pain and trauma, right? But to see ourselves in terms of a collective liberation of who we can be, right? What Robin D.G. Kelly calls freedom dreams, right? So for me, transnational politics is my freedom dreams for liberation. So I know that Magda introduced me. I will just say very briefly that my politics is rooted in an anti-capitalist space. Anti-capitalist vision of liberation. But importantly, as I said when I began, it is rooted in a politics of possibilities and regeneration and freedom, and not just for myself, but done within a collective space. So I'm going to start my talk by, I've called it my talk now. I'm going to start this conversation by reading something that, a part of something that I am writing. It was part of a webinar series that I facilitated that was co-organized by the Feminist Republic, which is a movement space of feminists on the continent of Africa, and the African Ecofeminist Collective, which I am the convener. So to read through it, and the title is Beyond Survival, Beyond Resistance, Weaving an African Feminist Politics of Regeneration. Who are we when we attend to the blows we receive, our historical wounds as a result of the systems and structures of oppression, from a place of strength, not alone as heroes of our pain, but in community? What new worlds can we imagine and really build if we see ourselves and our struggles as feminists in ways that reject being limited to silo movement building or colonially imposed physical borders and other borders also? What if you were to think of our politics beyond survival and resistance, which, while necessary, often work to limit our imagination regarding what possibilities we have at present as well as ahead? To think of healing, the kind of radical healing and weaving that is not simply predicated on our pain and suffering, but through a politics and a praxis of regeneration. And I continue with asking 4 very targeted questions, right? What has been the political project of our feminist organizing, and what has it revealed about the possibilities and limitations of both transnational and transversal feminist solidarities, while living in a world, right, that is going through the afterlives of colonialism, living through the impacts of neoliberal globalization, rising authoritarianism and fundamentalisms, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, and ecocide? Which new worlds and whose aspirations are being centered in our feminist movements on ecology, right? Are we centering the aspirations of the most marginalized, those on the front lines of the climate crisis, those living through the impacts of, as I've spoken, colonialism and living through neoliberal globalization? Or are we still centering the aspirations and movements or people, within particular spaces, especially very Eurocentric ideas of what climate justice means? Whose aspirations do our feminist movements and Is this better?
Yes, much better.
Okay, I'm so sorry. As I said, I'm not at home. All of us understand the complications of internet sometimes. So to continue very quickly, so the very final point in that train of thought: how can feminists think more critically about horizontal comradeship And this is something that is said or introduced to us by Chandra Mohanty. How can we move beyond essentialist notions of identity and biological alliances? How do we foreground political alliances and collaborations and co-create communities of resistance across cultural, gendered, sexual, national, and economic boundaries? So this year, and with the crisis that we faced, we found ourselves with particular possibilities to historicize the moment that we find ourselves in, right? And historicize and make meaning of the structural and systemic issues, the economic crisis, rising fundamentalisms, authoritarianism, ecological collapse, extractivism. And one of the things that we know very clearly is that, the crisis we find ourselves in with COVID simply surfaces already existing inequalities. Right? It surfaces realities because we already live in a world in which majority of the people are marginalized on the front lines of multiple and intersecting crises. It's never just one crisis. This crisis intersect in particular ways, right? And we live in this uneven world, right, with different development contexts and systemic vulnerabilities. When we think about the climate crisis that we find ourselves in at this particular moment. When you think about the fact that, countries in the global south, right, or countries that have contributed very little to the climate crisis, find themselves in a situation in which, especially within the international, whether it's the climate negotiations, or when you look at particular mainstream movements, right, that still tend to embody very Eurocentric ideas of justice, right? And of course, moving with that train of thought to the fact that, right, many mainstream ideas of what climate justice can look like basically focus on putting a price on nature, right? And we know the subsequent violations, right, around putting a price on nature, what the impacts of carbon markets, forest-related carbon markets, for example, the impact of geoengineering technologies. We know also the impacts of nuclear. In fact, where I am right now, where I'm having this call from, it's in a place called Lamu in the south, in the coast of the country. And there has been a big movement to reject a coal-fired power plant, which has largely been successful. So you see a very tiny island that's largely a fishing community that's beautiful, that looks literally like paradise, is struggling, to fight and resist a coal-fired power plant. So we see that these are some of the solutions that are proposed in terms of this is what climate justice means. But of course, grassroots movements, feminist movements working in ecology reject the financialization of nature, because the reality is we cannot solve the crisis from the same point in which we created the crisis, right? And we find when we think more critically about ecological justice or the climate crisis, right, we still find that there are no real mechanisms for poorer countries to force repayment from richer countries, other than that are popular. Basically possibilities of reparations, right? Continue to be impossible within mainstream dialogues and conversations and ideas of climate justice, right? To move ahead, we begin to see also. I'm going to quote from Mark Sigel, and he says that when you talk about, of course, other mainstream proposals, such as we see a lot of conversations around Green New Deals, especially within the US context, but also Green New Deal for Europe. And Mark Sigel says that we also ought not to forget that the original New Deal was social containment to avoid a transformed world. The dominant discourse also forgets that the original New Deal was only in the United States, and it took a world war and global decolonization to even begin to address the more widespread human consequences of colonialism, a condition which, after all, affected most of humanity, especially those lands now slated to suffer most under global warming. in taking stock of the climate crisis, then we need to be honest enough to state that the notion of a Green New Deal, as is, harkens back to the state social engineering of that particular period of time, right? And so how do we think radically about not just a Green New Deal, but thinking about a Green New Deal, for example, for those for feminist movements working, on ecology in the global north, right? In terms of collaboration, feminist movements working in the global south, to think about not just new deals, right? New social contracts, right? But to think about it in an anti-national and transversal way, to think about ecological justice, right? So one would be the importance of thinking through climate movements in the mainstream largely continue to center white Eurocentric narratives of crisis, right? And movement. So as I was saying, the fact that we continue to see a climate movement that continues to center white Eurocentric narratives of crisis. Movements grappling with resource limitations, NGOization, state repression. We continue to see techno-fixes being proposed as this utopias, utopias of climate justice. And these techno-fixes do not go to the roots of the structural roots of the climate crisis, the economic underpinnings, patriarchal underpinnings, right? Long histories of colonization, neoliberal globalization, right? Are never gotten to when it comes to these techno-fixes that are increasingly being promoted as the solutions for the climate crisis we find ourselves in. And we know that women, especially women in the global south, their marginalization continues to provide vicious incentives to the kinds of economic growth that we have and the kinds that are still being promoted by extractive industries. And even more specifically, right, we have to remember that corporate power, exists within particular systems. And, and these systems perpetuate and reinforce class, gendered, racial inequalities, right? And dismantling these inequalities to create genuine spaces for self-reflection over the lives of different people, those on the front lines of the crisis, right, needs to be done within collectives and within movements. Secondly, this crisis allows us, right, and when I say allows us, allows feminists, it allows all of us, but I'm speaking to the feminist body in its entirety, allows us to complicate the intergenerational histories and memory of and of a struggle, movement building, survival, which are often erased, read apart, and necessarily viewed in conflict with one another, very ageist sometimes, very romanticized, and subjected to multiple problematic gazes, whether it's a white gaze, whether it's a patriarchal gaze, right? And this truth-telling allows feminist movements, wherever they are, to build unlikely coalitions, because that is the power of transnational solidarity, the building of unlikely coalitions, right? Coalitions that are not meant to be because of the kinds of divides we find ourselves in, right? But this, as Jackie Alexander, to this becoming fluent in each other's histories, right, allows us to build unlikely coalitions, right, with one another, as well as to construct critical self-reflective selves, as well as communities. And we must also dialogue across difference and power. This is another thing that we find in this particular moment, the possibility of dialoguing across difference and power, right? So this movement, right, this moment in history, right, that we find ourselves, not just facing the ecological struggle, but facing this multiple struggles, right? This history, underscores the urgency for feminist movements on ecology, in their diversity, to critically think about what exactly does solidarity mean? And solidarity is obviously not charity, right? And solidarity, as Robin Kelly says, is not a market exchange, right? It is seeing the human in one another. It is thinking through a politics of justice. It is thinking through a politics of resistance. It is seeing our freedom dreams. And feminist movements working on ecology, if you're to say that we are really working for climate justice, but a liberated world in a bigger sense, it is impossible to do it within movements that are uncritical of capitalism. This crisis we find ourselves in, the ecological crisis and all these other crises that we find ourselves in, are rooted in a capitalist structure. And for as long as feminist movements working on ecological justice do not, I'm not saying they don't because they do, and I'm part of movements that, reject capitalism, and struggle against capitalism. For as long as movements don't resist and reject and build other worlds, right, we will continue to find ourselves, in the same crisis, in sort of a moment of, not a moment, because we have been in this moment for the longest time, just a continued loop of a reflexive politics of mutuality and accountability, which again is also part of building transnational feminist movements, right? In fact, to simply answer this question, what does solidarity look like for us as we work across difference and the various structural borders we have inherited and continue to reify? And finally, beyond a politics of survival, create a politics of regeneration. One of the things that has always been apparent to me is, am I still here?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I had to make sure. One of the things that has been very fundamental in my own politics being on this continent is, especially my work has centered largely on food sovereignty, working with peasant women farmers, working with farmers resisting commodification of seeds, of land, and food. And there's always been a politics of joy, a politics of life. They think about the work that they do, connecting with one another, farmers across different countries on the continent of Africa. They think of their work as a politics of life, a politics of healing and joy, a politics of celebration, and a politics of the commons, right? So so for me, it has always been, whichever feminist movements working on ecology or my movement work or my work in general, ultimately, that process of rejecting oppressive systems and marginalizations, has to center a politics of life, and colonialism, neoliberal globalization, patriarchy, homophobia, queerphobia, transphobia is ultimately a politics of death, right? And we have to think, what does joy and regeneration look like? A politics of life. What is possible for us within feminist movements, right? And in the ecological sphere, right? That means a politics of life means that we push back against neoliberalism and privatization that have had devastating impacts on, people across the world, right? We need to think transnationally. Capital moves across transnationally. And we also have to think about movements that are not so caught up, in silo politics. We have to see the kind of work that we do as one big part of one another, as a process, right? And it is important to also pay attention, even as we work transnationally, we have to pay important attention to local realities, right? So one of the things that I say, an ecofeminist movement to me is concerned with transforming the ways in which economic, intellectual, and ecological resources are accessed, yeah, and it's accessed especially by the most vulnerable, often those on the front lines of ecological devastation and climate change. It also means constantly working to reclaim and reimagine a much more just and egalitarian way of being with one another, right? And fundamentally for me, it has meant destroying patriarchy, destroying capitalism, and reclaiming the ideas of the commons. And over the last years, I've had the immense pleasure of being in community with various ecofeminist movements and ecofeminist activists, right, in different spaces, and mostly, especially during the UN climate summits. And it has been amazing for me to see feminists across the world come together to not only challenge the logic of extractivism, that politics of death, right, but also working in solidarity for the alternative world, right? So that is important. It has been important for me, right? To see it in action, to see movement in action, to see dialogue in action, to see a politics of regeneration in action. But it is not a kumbaya, solidarity is not kumbaya politics. The difficult truths that need to be spoken, the realities of the kinds of economic, political systems, to say the very least, that we find ourselves in, and why we find ourselves within these particular structures, right? And so for me, ultimately, and in conclusion, a truly feminist transnational approach to environmental activism means answering and dealing with the following questions. How do we move beyond essentialist notions and descriptions of our lives, right? Moving beyond biological essentialisms, for example, right? Realizing the kinds of how we are situated across the world, right? Realizing the kinds of privileges. And I really want to complicate the term privilege, because sometimes the way the notion of privilege is used, it sort of doesn't allow for that expansive analysis of structure and how privilege emanates. And also, dismantling particular privileges doesn't just come by stating that these are my privileges, which then becomes performance, right? It is for it to go beyond performance, because anyone can stand and say that these are my privileges, but what are you doing about it? If it becomes this performance or recital that is constantly done within feminist movements, right, where people constantly name their privileges but do nothing when it's women from the global south or feminists from the global south who are constantly doing the bulk of the work, where pay, for example, there are pay inequalities, right? So that checking of privilege, as people like to say, has to really focus on, we are checking our privilege by dismantling the structures that give these privileges, and especially give them in such unequal ways. But also the project is not, for me and for very many feminists working on ecology, the project is not power. It's in power in the sense that I also want to look like my oppressor, to have the things that my oppressor has. I want to destroy, right, the structures that make that kind of power possible. And that gets to the heart of transnational feminist work. It's not just, as I said, it's not just kumbaya, where we're just holding hands and singing and we're saying that because we are feminists, things are great, this is fantastic. We have to think about the internal dynamics of our movements, right? That is very important, right? It's important that we see this. We see that solidarity means something. Working transnationally means something. Rejecting borders means something. Rethinking economies means something very, very tangible. But finally, we don't have time. We are seeing the impacts of the climate crisis. Many of the milestones that were predicted for 2030 in terms of the ecological crisis are already happening. Whether it's floods in the Philippines that they've been having almost every single year. We see the floods that happen in the Philippines. The heat waves across West Asia, we see the impacts of, failing rains, on the continent of Africa. What does that mean, right? We see these things. And of course, increasingly we are seeing how environmental defenders are getting assassinated, murdered, raped, so on and so forth. So we are in a period of crisis. We have to remember that. And we have to act in very urgent ways. But working in very urgent ways, and for us to be effective together as a collective, we must also remember that we stand on particular structures, right? And for me, ultimately, that's how to think about an anti-capitalist, feminist and decolonial movement for ecofeminist, let me call it ecofeminist work. And of course, decolonization is not a metaphor. Again, like the privilege, check your privilege. Oftentimes, people keep talking about, decolonization in ways sometimes that empty it out, right? And I chose not to describe what I think decolonization is, but to simply explain, right? Same thing as what is my feminism, or what is, an anti-capitalist ecofeminist movement, but to simply walk you through the structures and the thinking and the possibilities of organizing together as feminists. I'll stop there. I really hope that the connection got better.
Thank you very, very much, Nyambura. And thank you also for your patience with the connection. I would say that we move on now to the Q&A session. We already got some questions via the Q&A tool. To everyone who's still with us, you can still write down your questions, or you can also raise your hand so we could unmute you and you could get into a verbal conversation with Nyambura. I would just now start reading some of the questions out to you, Nyambura. Sarah Suter is asking, can you tell us more about your activism, being engaged in feminist movements and anti-capitalism? In what activities have you been engaged? What do you think is most important about such groups?
Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Can you tell us more about your activism, being engaged in feminist movements and in general around anti-capitalist critique? In what activities have you been engaged? What do you think is most important about such groups?
All right. I'll start by saying this. One of the things I really want to emphasize is the fact that often, and this is part, I guess for me, it's part of decolonizing narratives. Oftentimes when we talk about, Africa, right? And of course, Africa is not a country. It's could literally fit even the United States within the geographical mass of Africa, and you still have more. Actually, you could fit in the US, you could fit in the continent of Europe, and still have mass left. But it's funny, you also have to remind people that we fought for independence. So there's a very long history of us rebelling, resisting, and imagining freedom. And we did it collectively, right? So I want to start by saying that there are many, many movements on the continent of Africa, thinking through a politics of ecology, right? Not just thinking through a politics of ecology, just to give an example. There are two big ecofeminist movements that I have been part of in one way or the other. One is the African Ecofeminist Collective, which I convene. And this is a space in which African feminists came together around 7 years ago, where we were like, look,
we're having conversations about ecology and the climate crisis on the continent of Africa, but the conversations are still very male dominated, right? Still very ensconced in very patriarchal, even the space, very patriarchal power relations, right? And we came together and said that we want something more, this spaces, right? And that's one. And we do political education, right? You also have other movements like warming, right? The Southern African rule. Yeah, so I was saying that this is some of the examples of the work that is happening on the continent of Africa. And you often see we're not just working in Africa also, we also link up with, you know, indigenous movements, for example, in North America. We work a lot with, you know, indigenous groups also in Latin America, in Asia, right? We work everywhere, right? We always have connections with movements and civil society organizations and NGOs across every space. So we're very connected to the conversations around climate injustice. One thing that I will say about this process of working together. One of the things that has been very important in terms of solidarity, and I see that it's one of the questions that has been asked, and I will just try and address it right now in the Q&A. One of the things that has been very helpful for us, even when I think about a politics of decolonization, has been having our allies, but in Europe, for example, and in North America, challenging the economic policies of their governments. Sometimes it's not about flying halfway across the world to go and support an organization. Simply challenging particular policies that your governments push. One of the things that really makes me infuriated, when you look at the UN climate negotiations, for those of you who follow, right, you have northern governments constantly blocking very progressive policies. In fact, even challenging, climate debt, ideas of reparation. And that would be a really fantastic starting point. What are your governments doing? What are your corporations do? What do your corporations do when they go abroad? When they pay paramilitaries, when they evade taxes, right? And these are the things that are important when we think about transnational organizing, that everyone plays their parts, but sees the other part as important to what they do. And that's what I would say. So that's why I said earlier that these movements are not just working on the continent. They have made links with organizations and movements from every single part of the world. That is very important. If you're going to support from Europe or North America or Australia or New Zealand or whatnot, these are some of the things to start. Actively challenging your government policies. Because sometimes I feel like it's not done enough. It's easier to say that I will go halfway across the world and support. But your governments, if I should say it, have racist policies, have classist policies, right? That should be where your battle begins. If you want to help, that is where the battle begins, right? That is what tangible solidarity is. And that's one of the things I was saying in my presentation. That is now structural analysis. That is the kind of solidarity that is meaningful, that is impactful for when we talk about how do we do a politics that is progressive in a real meaningful way, not just sloganeering that we're in solidarity with one another. No, solidarity is not a slogan. Decolonization is not a metaphor. It's not a slogan. It means things. It means actual things. I'm not sure if I heard there was a question after I disappeared.
First, thank you very, very much for your statement, Nyambura. We also got other questions now. I would say that some questions you already answered, because there was, for example, one question from Lisbeth Brandt, who asked, can you please explain the meaning of what you said, solidarity is not a charity, a little more. Is charity always anti-solidarity, or where's that line crossed? If you want to, you can add something to it.
It's a very good question. Actually, I must say the first, it's the quote, "Solidarity is not charity." It's actually a quote from Eduardo Galeano, who was, an Uruguayan writer. He wrote a book which I highly recommend if you really want to really understand a radical process of the impacts of colonialism, but also think about decolonization. So he wrote a masterpiece book called The Open Veins of Latin America. It's basically like a 500-year history of colonization in Latin America. And Eduardo Galeano said, solidarity is not charity. Is charity always, is solidarity always charity? Is solidarity always, is it always charity? It's, one of the things to remember, one of the things about your question to think with is the fact that charity emerges in very particular ways, right? Often, this is not to say that charities don't do good work, especially when you think about, donating to the homeless, shelters, and things like that. But the thing is this, when Eduardo Galeano says solidarity is not charity, he understands that we have to clothe the homeless, that we have to feed the hungry. But what he's saying is that, why are there hungry people in a world where we produce so much food? Why are people homeless across Europe while rich people literally have villas spread across the continent? So he says, I understand we have to feed the hungry, take care of the sick. But unless you actually figure out the structures that keep people hungry and poor, then your work is important, but it is not as radical as you think that it is. Because the political project is to live in a world where nobody is hungry, that people don't have to rely on food banks, that African farmers don't have to worry about producing food because of the subsidies that Western governments give to their farmers, but refuse African governments, for example, to give to their own farmers. It's looking at trade rules. What do trade rules do? Right? What do these things do? How do they contribute to destroying whole economies? What did neoliberal globalization do? When people talk about the continent of Africa, and they talk about, no hospitals or few hospitals in the education system. But this is systemic because you have policies that were put in place 40 years ago that demanded African governments in the public sector. So when I'm in Germany and I'm sick, or when I lived in Italy 2 years ago and I got all this fantastic healthcare system where the state still actively invests in the public health system, I appreciate it, but I realize that the global north in terms of policies is responsible for my government or African governments or Latin American governments or, governments in Asia to not be able to invest in their own public systems. So that's the thing. Charity, nobody's going to tell you not to feed the hungry. No, that's not what we're talking about. What we're simply saying is that we have to go beyond that and think about the systemic and structural issues at play. Because the thing is this, it's very easy to say that there are hungry Africans, and send food aid. But then, what happens to the farmers whose land is being taken away by corporations? So that is the thing, right? And the other thing is that the difference, it's also the difference of seeing that, of humanizing people, not humanizing people because you are able to give them, this whole thing that I'm a savior, because also charity does this in fact, sometimes I think about charity and I go back to a very, like Christian moralistic, the ways in which, religion, does charity, which again, I'm saying is not bad. But the point here is not to think about people in a more, this whole I'm a savior. We don't need saviors. Someone said, I need you to get your foot off my back. And that's what structural analysis means. Yeah. I can, should I just answer the questions in the, should I just keep going, or like, do you want to, Magda, you tell me.
I think you wanted to dive in now and ask a question on behalf of the audience.
Yeah, if that's all right, it's your time here. So you can also decide which way you'd like to go. So I'd just like to encourage all our listeners and viewers to maybe raise their hand and also ask the question maybe in person. Excuse me.
Okay. Maybe one question. I see a question by Sarah Sutter. I hope I'm pronouncing your second name right. How do you think about relating research to activism? Should researchers be neutral or start being more politically engaged? First of all, I don't think any researcher is neutral. Power relations are everywhere. It's like people who say that I don't really care about politics. The act of not caring about politics is political itself, because you are so privileged, so privileged, that you can afford to not think about the consequences of politics. And I don't just mean politics in like a representative democracy kind of way, but just life in general is politics. So I don't think that anyone is neutral. There's no neutrality, right? Because even neutrality, when people think about it, as I said, being neutral is also a very political act. Do we have to be ethical in our research? I say this, my responsibility, and I do research, is to be ethical in how I undertake research. But also one of the things to say about research work, and especially in academia, you think about anthropology and the very colonial racist, histories of anthropology. Sometimes a lot of the things, a lot of the times when people say, let's be neutral, it's basically saying that we need to continue with the same old patriarchal, racist, queerphobic, homophobic ways of doing research. So for me, my project is an ethical way of doing politics, right? But I say I'm not neutral. I'm definitely on the side of the oppressed. My politics is on the side of the oppressed. My politics is on the side of dismantling the systems and structures of oppression. Those are my political commitments, even as I am, of course, committed to a code of conduct when I do research. So that would be my my advice with regard to that a commitment to an ethical commitment, right? Code of conduct, obviously, that is ethical, of course, not enforces problematic power relations, but also to really think, what does it mean to say that I can be neutral? Neutral under what circumstances? Neutral in the face of a climate crisis that is drowning people, that is making people go hungry. Neutral in the face of hundreds of people sleeping on the streets, thousands of people not being able to get tested, not for COVID, not being able to get, grants and things like that. So we have to really ask ourselves, what is this neutral project that we are saying that we are part of? And I think that is a very political project, a political project that centers those who are privileged. That's what I think. There's a question by an anonymous attendee in terms of philosophical and sociological questions. Do you have certain, maybe also historical ideas and intellectual movements on which you mainly base your activism on? Definitely. I am very much inspired by anti-colonial movements in every single part of the world. Very, very inspired by the work that they do. I'm also inspired by the witches of Europe who were burnt at the stake because of leading very radical and progressive lives, you know? So I take my inspiration from their resistance and hope that my work continues to transgress. In addition to that, La Via Campesina, which is actually the largest social movement in the world, has been very central to my own work, and I've been part of spaces that they have been on the continent of Africa, but also just like collaborated with the movements within La Via Campesina in other parts of the world, landless people's movement, workers' movement in Brazil, for example. So, you know, of course, you know, Standing Rock movement, the long traditions of, you know, indigenous people in North America, specifically the US and what is called the US and Canada. So that is where I take my traditions from. And of course, most of these movements are they're leftist movements. So my politics is also left, I must say. So these are leftist movements in whichever different traditions, whether it's anarchist, Marxist, or whatnot. So that would be my intellectual. That is what my work is grounded in. Okay, anti-capitalist, feminist. Okay, all right. So Clara Zan is asking a question. I hope it's fine, Clara, that I mention your name. Like I'm mentioning names because I feel it's important to acknowledge. So you said that I've already answered your question on supporting projects in Kenya, and I get that it's very important to confront the government in my home country. But are there still projects in Kenya that I would recommend? I'll say this. So not just Kenya, I'll say it like on the continent. If you're going to support movements, but of course it's also important to ask what movements want. You know, to not presume that the kind of support you want to give is necessarily the one that they need. And that is part of a politics of solidarity, right? That you don't assume that, you know, someone needs a phone. Well, that the only thing they really need is perhaps, you know, to be able to get from one point to B. So I would say that for Clara and for everyone else interested, I would suggest particular feminist movements working on ecology in Africa that I've mentioned earlier. WOMIN, which is WOMIN, WOMIN, the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly, the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, the African Ecofeminist Collective, which is the collective that I am part of. So I would say that that's where you could, I'm not even going to call it support. That is a space in which if you wanted to engage seriously, that these are spaces to engage seriously. But of course, always take guidance, you know, in terms of what is actually necessary, what do people actually need for their work. So yeah, and that's sort of a response to the response to Didem. I hope I'm also pronouncing your name well. Of the examples of specific anti-capitalist feminist work for climate justice. WOMIN does anti-capitalist work. The African Ecofeminist Collective actually specifically does feminist anti-capitalist political education work on ecology. So we are feminist political ecologists. And we do our work, the kind of political education that we do, which actually borrows very heavily from the work of the Black Panthers, right? And also, you know, movements like PAIGC, which is an anti-colonial movement in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, the work of movements in South Africa for the liberation of South Africa, Mozambique, student movements against dictatorships in my own country in Kenya called Mwakenya, right? So this, so this, you know, these are the long traditions of the work that the African Ecofeminist Collective does. I think I've answered majority of the questions, or I think all of them. The ones in German, unfortunately, I can't read.
Okay, I will translate them. They both go in the same direction. For example, Christina, thanks you for the interesting talk, and Christina is also interested in social ecological topics, especially from a feminist perspective, and asks, are there any articles, books, or other talks and maybe speakers you could recommend to listen and to read, especially, again, from a non-Eurocentric perspective?
Okay. One of the things that, so as I said, that, so I'm also a feminist political ecologist. If someone was to ask me specifically in terms of like the intellectual sort of discipline and tradition that I find myself in. So I would recommend that a good start would be to read work on feminist political ecology. Not just political ecology, but feminist political ecology, which emerges in a very particular way to also critique the very patriarchal conceptions of political ecology, right? Wonderful people to read would be like, Indigenous scholars like Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who, while not a feminist political ecologist, but Linda Tuhiwai-Smith has been very, in fact, very monumental in thinking about indigeneity and research. Kim Tolbear, who is a fantastic scholar, right? And who has also extended, not just by herself, but as a collective of Indigenous feminist scholars in the US and Canada have gone beyond just feminist political ecology, but have, put in place, have enabled us to think about not just a liberal feminism, right? But to think about questions of indigeneity, questions of queerness, queer ecologies, for example, right? They've been very essential in that. On the continent of Africa, I would recommend Mariam Mayet, Wangoi Kamonji, who's actually part of the collective, the African Ecofeminist Collective, Connie Benson, Faiza Maya, who are very wonderful, fantastic activists in Cape Town working on water justice from a very feminist perspective. And they even produced a graphic book of around 60 years of histories of women in Cape Town resisting eviction during apartheid and after apartheid, but also connecting the question of land to a question of food, to a question of water. So this is some of the feminists that I would recommend. I'd be very happy to send to the organizers names and also just like books that have been so central to me, that have been very beautiful, brilliant for me to understand the intersection of feminism and ecology. But I must say this, an analysis of, you have to, the analysis also, you have to be careful that there's a way, especially when we write within a very academic setting, that we sort of erase the knowledge and the theoretical work that students are doing. I recommend reading the work of La Via Campesina, and La Via Campesina has a feminist wing. In fact, they have, it's called the Jakarta Declaration from 2013 or 14, where they really set out a feminist platform for the work that La Via Campesina does. So it's important to read movements in their own words, not just necessarily filtered by academics, even if the academics are very close, or researchers are very close to the movements. It's important to honor the theories, the ideas, and the politics of social movements, to engage with them in that way, because, I mean, without the work of movements, we really have no ways to think about climate justice. La Via Campesina, now food sovereignty, the term food sovereignty is very popular. Almost everyone knows about it. But La Via Campesina, we must not forget that this term comes from La Via Campesina. They gave us the term food sovereignty and the ideas and theories around what food justice can look like. And in addition to that, they were one of the first to have the most strong critiques of the World Trade Organization and especially WTO policies on food and trade, right? So we often think that movements are not thinking, are not writing, you know, which is very sad to think that, right? There's a class connotation around that. But movements, wherever they are, whether they're queer movements, you know, trans movements, sex worker movements, whichever they are, have a long history of thinking about their liberation in ways those outside of that struggle and movement building are not able to. So also read movement work. But I will send, I could send a reading list